Thanks for joining me to Quilt with Marcy Baker, where we enjoy our quilting even more. Today we're going to cover seam ripping, and you may want to know, how can I enjoy that? Well, I'm going to share with you 10 different methods for seam ripping, and I think you're going to enjoy at least one or two of them. I know I do. I wish I had known one of these whenever I was seam ripping this. I made this quilt top. It's a snowball block, and there's 4 triangles on the corners. I sewed them all on, I pressed them and found out I had sewn them onto the sides of the squares. So I had to rip all that out. If you know how to seam rip, you're going to have a lot more fun with your quilting. I have those 10 different methods. 4 of them work with the outside of the seam, on the outside of the fabric, and 6 work on the inside of the seam, separating the fabric as we go. Let's get started. We have a lot to cover. This is number 1 as far as methods, and I call it bobbing along. And I think we've all probably done it when we didn't know how the tension on our machine worked. I pulled this open a little bit. You really don't use a seam ripper much. And you get it started. And then you pull the bobbin. And it's so loose that you can pull it all the way down. If I hold on to it. You can pull it all the way down and it's out. That's bobbing along. I don't recommend it, but I do remember doing it. Okay, this is method 2. I call it gathering up. And I've learned how to set my tension. And whenever I start to do this, I'm going to open up just a few stitches so I can get a length of stitch going. And I think we use this whenever we've learned to set our tension, but the only way we know is to pull on the thread. And we pull it and gather it up until it breaks, or we can't get any more gathered, and then we come in and we use a seam ripper to break a thread, and we pull that, and now we go back to the other side and do the same thing. But it's because we don't know any other method that we start pulling on that thread. And this one, it's really tight and hard to do, so it breaks, and then we're back on this side. This is called gathering it up, and I do not recommend it. Okay, this is method 3, and I call it a stitch in time because it's going to take us a lot of time because we're doing 1 stitch at a time. And we're going to pull this back, and you can see the loop there. We're going to open that up, and we're going to pull another one back. I usually have this down on a surface when I'm doing it, but I want you to see it up close. So 1 stitch at a time is what we're doing. I would like to say I don't recommend it, but there are times when you need to use it. And in this case, I have very, very tiny stitches. I had it set at 1.5 millimeter, and it's just so hard to get that out of there. And you'll see some of the other techniques I show, they don't work unless you have a longer stitch. The other time you would use this is if you have a decorative thread or a decorative stitch, and that you need to get each of those stitches out at the right time. This is the 4th method, and it's called skip a stitch. Every 3rd, 4th, or in my case I do 5th, and we're going to break every 3rd, 4th, or 5th stitch, and then once we've done one side, we'll pull it on the back. And let me show you. This is my favorite seam ripper, and the reason I like it is it has a very sharp point there. It has a nice large handle that's oval, so it won't roll off the table. It has this rubber grip that makes it easy to hold, and later you'll see why I like the length of the shank on this. But for now, I can get this seam ripper in about I do 4th or 5th. And again, you're going to need to see what works for you. But just a couple more stitches and I'll show you what happens with this. Whenever I learned this, I had been quilting for about 7 years after sewing for probably 10. And when someone showed me this, I thought, why didn't my teacher show this to me? And I thought about it and I thought about it, and it's like, well, I was 11 and I was using that method of bobbing along. So this bobbing along was a lot easier than picking every 3rd or 4th stitch out. So I pull that, and we now have all these lengths of thread, and when you do 5 stitches, you get those to be a little longer. and as long as it pulls out. So now we have that is ripped out very easily. This is one of my favorite methods, and I highly recommend it. Just snipping every third or fourth stitch and turn it on the back and pull the long thread. So we've looked at 4 different methods that work on the outside of the fabric with the stitches. I have 6 other techniques to share, and those work on the inside of the fabric working on the stitches. These are faster generally. However, you want to be careful because we're working with blades, and those could be cutting the fabric and hopefully not cutting ourselves. So watch out for that, and let's look at these faster methods. This is technique number 5, which I call seam ripping. Literally, we are going to rip the seam. I've got this one here, this example, with a regular sewing weight thread, and this with a heavier weight. And I want to show the difference there. We're going to just take the ends, we've opened it up a little bit, and we're going to rip it apart. Now we've got some longer threads hanging off of it, which will be easy to clean up. And I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of wave in it, but I want you to show you, if you have a lighter weight fabric and or a heavier weight thread, whenever you go to rip this, okay, we got it open a little bit, you can see I stressed the fabric by doing that. And you don't know what you have until after you do this, so I don't recommend it. Like there we got some really stretching going on. I don't recommend this technique. You got to know what you're working with, and you're going to see so many other ways that are possible that it don't take that long, that it's worth not stressing your fabric. So this example here is with the really tiny stitches, and I call it an easier stitch in time, and we're going to open up the fabric and be able to work the stitches there in the middle. I'll see if I can do this so you can see it up closer. So you can see as I pull that away, I can see that loop and I can pull it. And it goes a lot faster. This is the same stitch length that I was working with earlier and the same threads. It's just going to work a lot easier. And once that thread gets pretty long, you can take and cut it so it goes faster. In fact, let's do that. So this is a stitch in time, but it's easier because it's on the inside of the fabric. Okay, here we're doing number 7, and I call it Blade Runner. It's a very common favorite for many people. I personally have not gotten used to the concept or the technique. I've not practiced it enough because I have other favorites, but I want to show you how this works, and I call it Blade Runner because we're going to use a blade to kind of run down the length of this stitch. And what's interesting on this, or different, is you almost need to have 3 hands, or it would feel better if you had 3. One, you're going to pull on this one and this one, so you got 2 hands there, and then we want to put a blade into it. In fact, I'm going to start with this one. I like this one. This is a men's electric trimming razor, so it's got a long-lasting battery in it, and you turn it on, and you're going to get that. See, here's why I don't use it. You're going to get the blade in there, and you're going to, my thumb is holding the fabric down, the pink fabric, and then the blade is, these fingers are pulling that back. And pretty much this one does not tear the fabric in any way. It just, it's just cutting the thread. And this is another tool. This is an eyebrow trimmer. There is one for the quilting industry, sewing industry. It's called Gypsy Quilter Eyebrow, or I would say thread cutter. And we're going to do the same thing. It's got a blade in there that's protected with some wires. There's wires on the razor blade there. So you just kind of work it back and forth, or you can go at it straight on. Whatever you're comfortable with, whatever works for you. I just have found that the manipulation of my hands of pulling the fabric apart and getting that seam in there it doesn't work for me very well. So you can try that out, see if it works for you. You've got a few threads coming off, but nothing, it's pretty much bigger threads. And that's another option. You can use a regular blade, Okay, again, and you might have these fingers hold this back. I think I can show you that. And this one's pulling. And either my blade is dull or I just don't have it with this particular blade. But it pulls back fairly easily. And I have seen people use a rotary cutter. And this is the one you want to be careful of. And I've seen them use it kind of like a pencil. And we're going to lock that in place. Don't do that for very much. And we're going to, my hand is holding this, and I'm going to use the blade here. You just got to work with it and see what works for you. So that's an option. It's not my favorite, but it will work, and I know a lot of people love it. So that's called Blade Runner, or that's what I call it. Here is method 8. I call it pushing down. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the blade in the seam allowance, and we're going to lift this, and we're going to just let the fabric fall down, and we're going to push our blade down into it. When I put the blade in, I'm going to take the tip of my seam ripper, and I'm going to put it in the seam allowance side, and the red ball goes on the other side, the good side of the fabric, and that's going to help save my fabric from being cut. And so I have that positioned, I say. Let me go at it from this way first. Okay. So I have my seam ripper positioned, and I'm going to take and let the gravity hold the fabric as I'm cutting. And yeah, there we go. And you can hear it popping as we go. And here I felt some resistance, so I look and I've got the seam tip coming out the side. Now I will say I used heavier thread on these samples so you could see the thread as I was working it. With this particular one, it's giving me some, it's making it difficult because I've got bigger thread in there. But it will work, especially on lighter thread. Let me try another seam ripper. Maybe that one's a little dull. And it's the point down into the seam, the red ball in that side. Oh, there you go. It was my seam ripper. Another reason why you need to realize it needs to be sharp. So we'll just put that one off to the side. So that's letting it fall down, and you're just, using gravity and pushing the blade down. This is method number 9, and I call it push away. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the same technique that I just showed, but we're going to have the fabric taut. And you need to have something hold the fabric. So I have this on my machine under the presser foot. Or I could use the corner of the machine, or you could use a friend to hold it. So you know that this end up here is held tight, and this end here I'm going to hold, and I'm going to put the seam ripper in just like we did before with the point in the seam allowance, the ball into the good fabric, and I'm going to hold it and I'm going to push. Okay, and that works great. It just takes care of it. We pretty much got long threads on the back. We got some short ones on this side. And so we've got that technique. You may like it a lot. Try it out. You want to be aware that the point can get into the fabric, and you can start cutting your fabric if you're not careful. But this is a technique that a lot of people like. I probably wouldn't pick it because quite often I'm seam ripping somewhere that I don't have something heavier to work with that kind of puts you at the seam allowance or at the sewing machine when you do that. And it's great for these long seams, not necessarily for the long, shorter stitches in the middle of a project. Okay, let's look at number 10, the final one. Okay, this is method number 10, and it is my favorite. I developed it after seeing number 8 and 9 and knowing some of the other techniques, and I like the concept of the blade and the stitch coming together, but I wanted more control. So here's what I came up with, because on those you can cut into the fabric pretty fast. This one you can also, but we're going to know ahead of time. We don't want to have resistance, because if there is, we need to stop and check and see what's going on. We're going to know ahead of time that we're heading into that problem. So I've opened this up a little bit. You're going to see me put the tip of the needle into the seam allowance just like we did before, and I'm going to put the ball into the good part of the fabric. Okay, so just like that, and between the layers. And you're going to see me make a movement like this. I'm going to put my fingers right here over the blade, and I'm going to pull them back, and I'm going to pull them back. And my fingers are just holding that seam ripper there. Just pull them back, okay? That's what we're going to do. And so I'm going to put that in here. And this hand is just going to hold the fabric. I'm not going to push, okay? I'm pulling. So we're going to take and listen for the popping. And I can just keep going. And you can't see my face, but I can look away while I'm doing this. You can see how easy it is. This hand is just holding the fabric. If you start to feel some resistance, which I'm forcing that to happen, my seam ripper may have come out. And if for some reason you find it keeps wanting to go a particular way, you might try the other end and find that it works better, because our thumb is generally stronger than our pointer finger, and one fabric may be heavier than the other, and therefore it may be affecting it. Now, can you see why this is my favorite technique? I mean, I can go fast, but I'm in control, and it just is awesome. When it works great. It doesn't work every time, not, depending on the thread, depending on the fabric, but it works, and it's just like awesome. You can see this thread building up. Oh, I'm done. And that's the thread that we had building up. And then we have some longer threads. But I know a lot of people like this or another seam ripper that has a rubber end so that they can take and go like that to get rid of it. This particular one has rubber on it, but not necessarily for that. But you can get it at an angle and use it for that purpose too. So that's number 10, my favorite. And I call it pulling, because you're just pulling the fabric into the blade, and I just love it. I hope you can try it out, see if it works for you. If you get it, it's, holding this and moving your fingers is probably going to be the challenge, but if you get it going, you're going to love it. You need to remember to keep a sharp seam ripper. We talked about the different points and so forth, but a sharp blade makes all the difference in the world. If you're still using the one from 4-H or home economics, you need to get a new one, and you deserve it. Who knew that there could be so many different methods for seam ripping? We talked about 4 of them that work on the outside of the fabric with the stitch, and then we had 6 that we worked on the inside of the fabric, working with each stitch on the inside. Those were faster and easier. However, you needed to be aware of where the blade is. Look at your project. Consider your fabrics, your threads, your stitches, and choose the one that fits your project. You may also need to consider whether you have arthritis. There may be a better one or some adjustment or difference to the ones I shared that will work better for you. So look at those and consider them, and I hope you enjoy your seam ripping from here on out. Thank you for joining me at Quilt with Marcy Baker. Enjoy your quilting.